The last thing Poon Lim remembered seeing above the deck of the British merchant ship was a flash of metal and the violent spray of seawater. A German U-boat's torpedo had struck without warning, splitting the vessel open before anyone could shout an order. The explosion shoved him backward, and a curtain of heat and smoke rolled over the bow. Men were screaming, stumbling toward lifeboats, but the ship was already listing hard. The sea was climbing the deck like a rising wall. Poon plunged into the dark water, kicking hard to avoid the suction as the ship sank beneath him. Debris drifted around him: wood, rope, oil drums, fragments of the lifeboats. He grabbed the edge of a small wooden raft and pulled himself on top. It wasn't a regulation lifeboat. It was a square emergency float, barely large enough for one person, made of wood planks and empty water drums lashed together. It rode low in the water. Every wave slapped the boards under his feet. He watched the last ripple of the ship disappear, along with every other person aboard. The sky smelled of fuel. Pieces of cargo bobbed on the swells like broken teeth. He was alone in the South Atlantic, hundreds of miles from shipping lanes, with no rescue coming. At first, he tried to track time by the sun rising and falling, but everything blurred. He tied himself to the raft at night to keep from sliding into the sea while he slept. Days felt slow, like thick syrup. The sun baked through his clothes, and the salt carved cracks into his skin. The fresh water he found in a single container didn't last long. Once it ran out, he caught rain by spreading out a canvas scrap and funneling droplets into a bottle. When there was no rain, he soaked rags in seawater, let them dry halfway, then sucked the remaining moisture from the fibers. It tasted harsh, but it kept him alive. Food was harder. He had a single biscuit tin from the wreckage. That lasted only a few days. After that, he learned to watch the surface of the water for shadows. When small fish circled the raft, he unraveled wire from a lantern frame and sharpened it against the metal rim of a drum. He fashioned a hook, tied it to part of a rope, and held it in his hands until something bit. The first fish he caught, he ate raw. The next, he dried in the sun so it would last longer. He forced himself to ration what little he had. Hunger never left. It only quieted enough to let him focus. Sharks visited often. At night, their fins cut through moonlit waves as they circled him in slow, lazy loops. They bumped the underside of the raft, testing it. He stayed perfectly still. Once, after catching a fish, he sliced his finger. The blood drifted into the water and the sharks appeared within minutes. That night, he tied the cut hand against his chest, terrified the smell would bring them closer. Storms were the worst. The raft wasn't built to handle towering waves. Each one lifted him high and dropped him into a trough so deep he couldn't see the horizon. The wind tore at the wooden planks, and the drums groaned at every impact. Several times he believed the next wave would flip him into the black water. He lashed himself tight to the raft and held on as the rain stabbed his skin like needles. When the storm finally passed, he checked every rope, every knot, and every plank. Survival was maintenance. Constant, relentless maintenance. As weeks dragged into months, his body shrank. His clothes stiffened from salt. His hair grew wild, and his skin darkened under the sun until people would later describe him as barely recognizable. Loneliness settled on him like another weight. Sometimes he spoke out loud just to hear a voice. When that wasn't enough, he focused on tasks, fixing ropes, reinforcing boards, sharpening tools. Motion kept despair away. Twice he saw ships. The first passed so far away that it barely appeared as anything more than a distant outline against the horizon. He waved a shirt in the air, but the vessel kept moving until it disappeared. The second came close, so close he could see men on deck. He shouted, he waved, but the ship sailed on. Whether they didn't see him or mistook him for floating debris, he never knew. The sight crushed him. For a full day after, he struggled to find the will to move. He created structure to stay alive. He measured the days by what he could control: fishing, repairing, resting, collecting rain. He kept his hands busy, even when his mind drifted. He told himself that rescue was possible as long as the raft held. He refused to let the idea of dying at sea take root. On one morning, months after the shipwreck, he saw something unusual in the distance. It wasn't a ship. It was a line, thin, gray, stretching across the horizon. Land. The current had carried him toward the coast of Brazil. As he drifted closer, fishermen spotted the strange shape in the water and steered toward him. Their voices cut across the waves. The sound didn't feel real at first. They pulled up beside the raft and stared at him in disbelief. He was sunburned, skeletal, and barely strong enough to lift his head, but he was alive. When they helped him onto their boat, he collapsed. The fishermen carried him to shore and brought him to a hospital, where doctors measured how close he had come to death. His heart was weak. His muscles had deteriorated. But his mind was clear. He knew exactly how long he had been on the raft. 133 days. He had drifted more than 1,000 miles across the Atlantic. No castaway in modern history had survived alone at sea for that long. British officials later questioned him carefully, certain no one could endure such harsh conditions without exaggeration. But every detail he described checked out. The fishing methods, the storms, the water rationing, the makeshift tools. The story was real. The British government eventually awarded him a medal for outstanding endurance and resourcefulness. Naval instructors even used his account to teach sailors how to survive at sea. Poon Lim didn't call himself a hero. He said he lived because he refused to die, because every day he found one thing he could still do, one task he could complete, one more piece of rope he could tighten. He carried the memory of those 4 months with him for the rest of his life. He later told reporters that the ocean felt both enormous and indifferent. There were days when the loneliness felt heavier than hunger. Days when the sharks circled too close. Days when he believed he'd disappear without anyone knowing what became of him. But he held on. When people asked how he lasted so long, he gave the same answer every time. He stayed alive by refusing to give up the smallest thread of hope. "I can make it one more day," he told himself. Then another. Then another. Until finally, land appeared on the horizon, and he understood he had outlasted the impossible. Thank you for listening to Horrifying Survival Stories. Subscribe for more stories of those who faced the impossible and lived.